Haki Hawesi Lasamamo. My name is Paulette Blanchard. I'm a citizen of the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma and Kickapoo descent. I live in the traditional lands of the Wichita, Caddo, and Osage, and which is now the citizen Potawatomis and the absentee Shawnees lands now through forced relocation. I'm not seeing the word cloud up right now. There we go. Lovely, lovely. So from the registration, there were questions about convergent science, about the interpretation or the how you as participants might define convergent science. And these are this is the word cloud that they put together from this. And I thought it was really, really cool to see some of the ways these words were put together. And one of my favorites is under the word convergence that says convergent science needs wisdom, or coming voices need wisdom sciences. And I thought that was so well put right under climate ways, science convergence, you know, that coming voices need wisdom sciences. It can't be more clear than that. So I really appreciate the way this was put together and some of the themes that have come out of this. I hope you see and work with throughout the entire conference. Another thing that I want to bring to the attention of our participants is hopefully there's a lot of new participants, because every year we seem to draw more. I hope you've had taken a moment and gone and looked at the history of Rising Voices, about why Rising Voices, the website, the introductory video, and maybe checked into some of the previous workshops to see some of the work that has been being done over the years and continues to grow and thrive and expand, honestly. So this particular workshop, we've been talking about justice and what does convergent science and justice, how does that fit together? Well, first, you know, we have talked already about convergent science. What does convergent science mean to you, or how do you identify it? And I think that's a great place to start, because from that, we really need to focus on, what does justice mean? What does justice mean in science? How is justice defined in mainstream sciences? And is it even a part of the discussion? So in looking through it, I looked at environmental justice, social justice, and it all seemed to center around the human experience, human aspects. But I think there's more to it. I believe that justice has to incorporate and encompass and support the rights of the Mother Earth, the rights of plants and trees and animals, and all of these interconnected systems and complex patterns. They have a right to exist, and they are the ones at this point in time need the most justice centering. So I think going forward, I hope that all of us keep in mind, how will convergent science incorporate justice in that mindset beyond the human anthropocentric definitions? Because without our systems being healthy, we as human beings will continue to degrade along with our environment. So that is my interpretation of how justice and convergent science might work together. So I do hope all of our participants take a moment and really, for themselves and each other and the work that they do, think about how justice for them might be incorporated into the work they do or you do, and how we together, bringing all of our disciplinary siloed knowledges, break out of those silos and really reach across boundaries and blur all of those boundaries to find ways that we can do convergent science with justice being centered and not centered on the human this time. So in that, I will transition into our talk about our amazing keynote speaker, who is one of my sheroes and one of my favorite human beings in the world. I've had an opportunity to spend time with her as friends and giggle and have dinners. And Robin Kimmerer is Dr. Robin Kimmerer is a mother, a scientist, a decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, which has earned Kimmerer wide acclaim. Her first book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing, and her work has appeared in Orion, Whole Terrain, and numerous scientific journals. She tours widely and has been featured on NPR, On Being with Krista Tippett, and in 2015 addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations on the topic of healing our relationship with nature. Kimmerer lives in Syracuse, New York, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teacher Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both Indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals and sustainability. As a writer and a scientist, her interests in restoration include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restorations of our relationships to the land. She holds a BS in botany from SUNY ESF and an MS and PhD in botany from the University of Wisconsin, and is the author of numerous scientific papers on plant ecology, bryophyte ecology, traditional knowledge, and restoration ecology. She lives on an old farm upstate New York, tending gardens, both cultivated and wild. And please give her the warmest welcome we can today, because she is a shero and an amazing human being, and ever so generous with all the mentors and mentees that she's had in her life. So thank you. Please welcome Miss Dr. Robin Kimmerer.
Miigwech, Paulette, my sister, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you. And it's beautiful to look around this room of all these participants and see old friends and folks I haven't met yet, and I sure am looking forward to the dialogue and the opportunity to learn from everybody. I want to start in a traditional protocol greeting and say, Bonjour in Dinemewa Malganodok, Shabadaske Gish Kokwe Nadesnakos. Bodwe wad mi kwenda anish nabe megaze dodem minwa mako dodem. And I should have turned my phone off in the background in my office, not in this gorgeous rural landscape. With those greetings, I told you that I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, member of the Bear Clan, and also of the Eagles, and I'm so grateful to be here with you. I'm going to share screen so we can look at some of our plant and animal relatives to be with us as we are all staring at our computer screen. So hopefully that is going to work just fine here. Let's see. Oops. Come on. There we go. Why is this? Let's see. There we are.
Robin.
Okay, good. I think we're good now. All right. It's always some kind of glitch. There we go. Come on. There we are. All right. So another component of a traditional protocol is that we always begin with gratitude. And so I want to have us remember that this morning when we first put our feet on Shkopnikwe, that we had everything that we need. That first breath of beautiful morning air on a September morning, food, a drink of cool water, the companionship of clouds and geese and the sky, the companionship of one another. I also want to acknowledge with great gratitude the privilege of being in this Rising Voices community, the privilege and the honor of the meaningful and really transformative work that we are all doing together. And when I look at all of your faces, it really heartens me for the future that we are going to create together. I also want to tell you that I am speaking to you from today. Today, the landscape that you do see in the background are the ancestral and continuing homelands of the Onondaga Nation, the heart of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to whom we owe an unpaid debt of history, of land, and certainly of knowledge of how it is that we care for our beautiful homelands. And when we think about these gifts, for which we give great gratitude, we're showered with these gifts, and yet most of us are deeply enmeshed in institutions and in extractive economies that are constantly asking, what more can we take from the earth? And as we center justice today, the question I think we need to be asking, and certainly which underscores my work, is what does the earth ask of us? How do we engage in reciprocity with the living world? And when I put together just sort of a collage of some thoughts about that, which does not rival that beautiful word cloud that you shared with us, Paulette. Wasn't it interesting how poetry emerged from that word cloud? It was really beautiful. But as I began thinking about what are all of the ways, some of the ways that we can reciprocate these many gifts of the earth, the two on my word collage that really, of course, spoke to me for today are the notion of justice and science, that these are both ways that we can reciprocate the gifts of the earth that we have been given. And so I'm going to start with justice, to center justice, and then think about how do we do science in that context. And when I think about, well, what does justice look like when I think about justice for the land? I really think about justice for who? Is this justice for just for human beings, for all people, for all persons, for the land itself, for all of our plant and animal relatives? This question of justice for who should be informing the work that we do together. And of course, addressing this question of centering justice in science really depends on what we mean by justice, right? And so again, kind of a collage of the ways that justice is defined and understood in various cultural contexts. And they're familiar to all of us. And I want to particularly point to this notion of protection of rights, because that is often understood as what we mean by justice. But in the Indigenous way of thinking, we are often more oriented not to protection of rights, but enactment of responsibility. And reframing justice not as necessarily protection of rights, but protection of our abilities to fulfill our responsibilities is at the heart of my thinking. And so with that notion of responsibility in mind, I wanted to think about Anishinaabe concepts of justice, not necessarily only the Western ones in which we are embedded. And in my admittedly limited understanding of the nuances of Anishinaabe justice, the focus of making justice, for justice is a verb, justice isn't a noun, it isn't an endpoint that you get to, it is a dynamic, ongoing process of making justice, in which the focus is really on relationship, to focus not so much on the harm, but on the relationship between the offender and the offended, and this notion that the offense occurs because the system is out of balance, that there is, that the harm reflects kind of illness. And so justice in the Anishinaabe way is really thought about in terms of healing, and how do we create this healing and regenerate balance. So in that context, I think about justice as restorative justice for the land and for all of the people. And by the people, I mean the human people, as well as our more than human relatives. So let's ask ourselves again, what might justice for the land look like in this context of healing and restorative justice? We could talk for hours about this question, and here are just some little samples to think about what justice for the land might look like, and I'll focus on just a few. But restoration, rematriation, meaningful consultation as opposed to the fairly empty consultation that often passes for collaboration, co-management, creating Indigenous land trusts. There are all kinds of ways that we might enact justice on the land and engage this convergent science in doing so. But justice for land loss inevitably means land back, land returned. And in order to enable the creation of these Indigenous protected areas, to rematriate lands to Indigenous stewardship, this requires the kind of convergent science that brings us together. Echoing Paulette's introduction, we hadn't talked, but I think that one of the important elements of creating justice is also the rights of nature, right? This new emerging system of jurisprudence that has its grounding in Indigenous wisdom and worldview, that notion of the personhood of all beings, of our more than human relatives. It's not anthropocentric, but biocentric. It is centered on the continuity of life. And you know many examples, certainly the one that is very much in the public mindset is the personhood of the Wanganui River by our Maori relatives, not granting, but recognizing the inherent right of the river, to more recent examples of how the Yurok Nation has granted the recognition of these inherent rights of a person to their Klamath River, to the recent recognition of the rights of Minoman, of wild rice, to possess these inherent rights to exist, to regenerate, to evolve, as well as these inherent rights to restoration, recovery, and preservation, which sounds like justice to me. So let's go back here to think about not only justice, but doing science in a context that creates justice. And I am so mindful of having 30 short minutes to talk about these deep, rich, complicated ways of thinking, but I am going to put my trust in your hands that you have already been thinking about these things. And my job here is perhaps just to help us remember and to stimulate some thought in these arenas. And so let's now turn our attention to what is the role of the ecological sciences and how do they contribute to creating justice for the land. I'm going to do that with a little bit of a conceptual framework and then dive into a case study, as I was asked to, that illustrate some potential thinking about how we might answer this question. And I think that one of the most powerful tools that we have as Indigenous scientists, coupled with the knowledge of the land herself, is to enact justice using scientific tools in the form of restoration, both ecological restoration and then you'll see as biocultural restoration as well. Here we are on the cusp of climate catastrophe, in the age of the sixth extinction, when the weight of the future is heavy on all of our shoulders. And it is in this context that we remember that it's not enough just to protect the remnants of our beloved homeland. We have to heal the damage that we have done. And that is restorative justice for the land and for the people who depend on that land and care for that land as well. And within everybody sitting in this webinar, I'll bet you could put together your own list of examples of ecosystem restoration related to Indigenous land justice. A few to prompt your remembering: the amazing work with wolf restoration led in a collaborative by the Nez Perce Nation, thinking about the many nations who have been involved in healing damage to land and our relatives through bison restoration, as well as grassland restoration. I think of our relatives in the Pacific Northwest, in the Columbia River Basin, who are using treaty rights, using Indigenous science to protect not only the salmon, but the watersheds on which they rely. A big, broad vision of how convergent science can enact justice for all. And then I think here in my own homeland, here where I live in Onondaga territory, the leadership of Onondaga Nation in putting forth a vision for the restoration of Onondaga Lake, a sacred site which also has been designated as one of the most chemically polluted lakes in the country. So many examples. And I have worked for some time in the realm of restoration ecology. And in doing that work, designing healings and healing interventions in a way for the land, it doesn't take long to recognize that it's really not the land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that has been broken. The sacred lake filled with mercury is a sign of a broken relationship with land, and that needs to be healed simultaneously with healing the waters and the fish and the eagles who fish there. But how do we do that? What does that look like to restore relationship to place? Can we use our convergent sciences to think about how do we restore subsistence relationships for foods, medicines, and all of those gifts of the earth that sustain by which we sustain ourselves and our relatives. This is a kind of embodied reciprocity, a justice that is manifest in our well-being. If we are to do that, it means that we also have to reclaim the Indigenous science and philosophy that underpins our tending relationship to those places, because this too is a way that we enact justice on the land, not by claiming our rights, but by enacting our responsibilities of caregiving for all of those other species. Ceremony, we know, is a powerful way of enacting our reciprocity through our intention and our spiritual purposes. Restoration of foodways is a really vital part of restoring relationship to place. Restoration of language, restoration of place name falls in here as well. We could think of many, many examples together, and I hope that we will in the discussions that follow. But what all of these have in common: bison restoration, salmon restoration, food sovereignty, we need the science that underpins this. We need science-directed, heart-driven, justice-driven science, which is directed by these community priorities. Not knowledge just for knowledge's sake, but knowledge in service to justice. Knowledge where we reflect and respect those more than human teachers of how we do this work together. And we know that restoration of relationship to place is outside the realm of scientific ecological knowledge or SEK. The approach, the reductionist materialist approach to SEK doesn't enable us to incorporate values and ethics in that work. So we're going to need a different kind of science, a symbiosis among ways of knowing that brings us some of the tools of Western science and the values and guidance of Indigenous science. And I'm so grateful for this beautiful graphic made by one of my students that reminds us that most of us are working in institutions where Indigenous knowledge has been, at best, marginalized and more often erased. And so this convergent science is the science of two-eyed seeing. It's science which embodies all the ways of knowing around the medicine wheel. Not only the intellect and the mind that Western science privileges, but also to bring our emotional intelligence and spiritual guidance into this work. Then we are really doing transformative science that works toward justice. Western science, and I am a Western scientist as well as an Indigenous thinker, I think that one of the important things to think about is how we deploy these different sciences for what kinds of questions. And in my sense, Western science with hypothesis testing and its insistence on objectivity is a brilliant set of tools for true false questions about the living world. It has brought us great advancements in our understanding. But the crises that we face, and in order to work justice on the land, we need more than objectivity. We need more than true false questions. We need complicated questions and therefore complicated approaches which incorporate values. And this is the approach that we try to take at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment here at SUNY ESF, where our mission is really to guide the tools of Western science with Indigenous values. And while I have this graphic up here, I would be remiss in this audience if I didn't tell you that we have a thriving graduate program here dedicated to this proposition of two-eyed seeing. We also have a faculty position open at the moment in exactly this realm. So if you're interested, get in touch with me and I'd be happy to tell you more. At the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, the metaphor, the model that we try to use in governing our research approaches is beyond, or maybe an expansion from two-eyed seeing. I was asked to talk about methodology in this section, in this keynote. And so the methodology that really guides our thinking is this of a garden, of planting a knowledge garden where there is a mutualism among knowledge systems, not just to have them be side by side, but to think about how they might work together. And again, centering the knowledge of the land, the Indigenous pedagogy of learning from the land, learning from intelligences other than our own, this framework for doing research and practice is really grounded in the knowledge of the Three Sisters Garden. It's grounded in the knowledge of our plant teachers. Remembering that in a Three Sisters polyculture, we're not growing one crop alone. We're not using one knowledge alone. The Three Sisters garden, corn supports the beans, doesn't it? Increasing light availability for them. The beans that are climbing that corn don't get a free ride. They're fertilizing the soil, aren't they, with nitrogen fixation. And then the squashes at the feet of the garden are keeping the soil moist and suppressing weeds. The result, as you know, in a Three Sisters garden is that there is more food, more nutrition. It's better for people. It's better for the land when these grow together. Inspired by these teachings of the plants, we think about planting a knowledge garden. And at the center of this knowledge garden is traditional knowledge, not a sidebar to research, but at the center. Just as we plant the elder species, the corn, first in our garden, we nurture that corn until it's strong enough and independent, and then we plant the beans. Because corn, the elder knowledge, and in our knowledge symbiosis, it is centered. It is the intellectual scaffolding for all of the research that follows. And then we plant the beans. Beans, I think, are an analog to scientific knowledge, wandering, curious, propelled by that power of nitrogen fixation. But beans alone, beans without something to guide them and climb on them, are less productive and can in fact overtake many other aspects of the garden. So the beans need to be guided, as they are guided by the leaves of the corn. Could we have beans guided by the leaves of that intellectual scaffold, the values of Indigenous knowledge? And then the squash. We think about the squash as the one who has created a microclimate in which beans and corn can grow together. I think that is our work in our institutions, in this conference, as we bring our gifts out into the world, is to create a climate in which Indigenous science and Western science can grow together. What a mission that is, right? That we all are engaged in doing this work, so that rooted in the land, in the knowledge of the land, we center traditional ecological knowledge in our research, use the tools of scientific ecological knowledge guided by those principles, and then create a collaborative microenvironment in which they flourish. A symbiosis where scientific knowledge is in partnership and complementarity with traditional knowledge so that all are fed. Importantly, in a Three Sisters garden, there is sovereignty of those knowledges. We're not talking about blending them. The corn doesn't become the bean. The squash doesn't try to become the corn. What makes the system work is that they're all different, that they have their strengths, they have their gifts, and that we create a microenvironment in which those gifts can be complementary. I would like to think, lastly, for the case study that I was asked to share, a case study of trying to apply this Three Sisters garden thinking to a research question associated with restoration. And restoration, again, is not only the healing of land, but healing of relationship. It is an opportunity for what the great Gary Nabhan, wonderful ethnobotanist and writer, has called restoration. That doing restoration research gives us an opportunity to tell a different story about our science, to create this convergent science that centers justice as well. Because the kind of restoration we want to enact is holistic. I think of it as reciprocal restoration. Back to that question of how do we reciprocate the gifts of the earth, not just with restoration, ecological restoration, but reciprocal restoration, where there's this mutual reinforcing, so that as we use our science to care for the land and culture, when we restore the land, it contributes to cultural restoration or to cultural revitalization. And renewal of cultural lifeways promotes restoration of ecological integrity. And that, to me, is like a verb for doing justice to land, and for people. Land justice, for me, is a kind of reciprocal restoration. And so, to close briefly with a case study of some work that it was done with students many years ago now, but I think it's really a good story for making justice on the land. So I'll share it with you here, guided by this model and guided by our teacher Wingosh Sweetgrass. And this plant is at the heart of the research case study that I want to share with you. And Wingosh is an important plant here in Haudenosaunee territories as well as Anishinaabe territories. It's important to all of us, this sacred plant. And in this example, using the Three Sisters teachings, we centered traditional knowledge in this research, because this research question was brought to us by knowledge holders in communities. They came to us, to the university, and said, we have long experience with relationship with Sweetgrass. And Mohawk basket makers came to us and said, the Sweetgrass does not seem as vigorous and healthy as it once did. The places that we used to find it is disappearing. Could we work together to try to understand how to care better for Sweetgrass? So at the center of this knowledge symbiosis are the hypotheses, the observations, and the knowledge of the community themselves. And to collapse years of study into just a few slides, let me highlight the work of then graduate student, today professor, Daniela Shevitz, who's doing wonderful work today in this arena still. What she did is to work with the basket makers and to work with scientific sources to say, where did Sweetgrass used to be? And she went to visit all of those places, as many as she could, and categorize the reasons that Sweetgrass might not have been there anymore. The red dots here are places where Sweetgrass was traditionally gathered and is still there, and the blue dots are places where it was no longer found. And she was able to identify some of the reasons for that and initiate a successful restoration in a Mohawk community, so that Mohawk people again had Sweetgrass available to them. But the basket makers came back to us and said, well, what about overharvesting? We haven't talked about that yet. Let's look at the relationship between harvesting methods and the well-being of Sweetgrass. They brought to us that there were several different ways that harvesters traditionally practiced Sweetgrass gathering using the honorable harvest, and asked if we could do those experiments. Because in harvesting Sweetgrass, in the Indigenous worldview, we know that if we use that plant respectfully, it will flourish, right? If we ignore it, if we don't use it, if we don't tend it, it will go away. But in the Western paradigm of conservation of exploited plants, there's this idea that the way that we conserve plants is by limiting harvest, by keeping people away, right? So these are two different ways of thinking about the knowledges that we might bring to evaluating the role of the harvesters. And we brought both of those perspectives into an experiment where we did experimental harvests as taught by the basket makers themselves, with the expectation within the Western paradigm that the sweetgrass that was not harvested would do better than the sweetgrass that was. And what we found, of course, was exactly the opposite. What we found is in the places where we experimentally harvested using the honorable harvest taught to us by the basket makers, with either the grabbing method or the pinching method. I don't have time to go into them here. But the most important thing that you see here is that the control plants that were not harvested at all were essentially declining. Those places where people were harvesting and interacting in a good way with those plants were thriving. They had much higher regeneration rates. What Lori was able to demonstrate was that traditional harvesting practices stimulate the growth of sweetgrass. You see what we're doing here, using the tools of Western science, guided by the knowledge and the wisdom of the traditional basket makers. How does this relate to justice? Sorry, one more point here. One of the ways to understand what's happening here is that this notion of compensatory growth. On this chart, what you see here is the effect on a plant of herbivory, or in our case, we weren't eating the sweetgrass, but we were harvesting it. There are some plants, like plant A, if you harvest them or eat them at all, they decline. There are some, like species B, that can tolerate some level of harvest, and then they decline. And then there are some plants who, when you harvest them, they grow faster. And if you take too much, they decline. But if you take just the right amount, they grow faster. What was sweetgrass doing? Pretty obvious here. And so we go back to those two ways of knowing complementarity in the sweetgrass garden. Did our experiments show that if we use a plant respectfully, it will stay with us and flourish? If we don't show it respect by not harvesting it at all, it will go away. Yes, that is exactly what our data show. You can also rephrase that in terms of the Western scientific language. Use, i.e. harvesting, creates disturbance gaps, which can stimulate compensatory growth, reduce resource competition through reduced density. Also true. A knowledge garden, where these two ways of knowing magnify our way of thinking. The lessons from sweetgrass are that people sustain people, plants sustain people, people sustain the plants by playing an active role. What does this mean in terms of land justice? This convergent science means that if we are to restore these plants, we have to restore the harvesters. That we have to have that justice for the plants means justice for the harvesters. That this is the kind of science that can lead us to land justice, of return, of access and tenure to Indigenous homelands for the benefit of all. Mi'il, miigwech, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was absolutely lovely. And if you don't mind, we have a couple of questions here. And please, I'd like to remind the audience, if you have a question, in the chat is a link for the Slido. You can upvote questions and that creates more people interested in that specific question. And the first question is from Katie. Who gets to decide what restored means for the ecosystem? Can data be used to listen to the land and what it wants and needs? And how do we decide what restored means, especially when climate change makes what once was harder and harder to return to?
Such an important question. And particularly this notion of what is the restoration goal, right? The so-called reference ecosystem. And to me, this is why it's really important that we take a biocultural approach to restoration, not just to restore structure and function to an ecosystem in some kind of fixed configuration, but that it is important to return structure and function, but in service to relationship with other members of the land community, including human people. So this biocultural approach would involve human values, human relationships, as well as more than human relationships, in deciding what that reference ecosystem might be. To just touch upon the second part of your question, oftentimes the reference ecosystem, or the goal of restorations, particularly in many government-led projects, is to restore the ecosystem to some sort of pre-settlement equilibrium, which kind of cracks me up, because the pre-settlement equilibrium really, of course, involves Indigenous land management, is sometimes unacknowledged by the folks who are making that goal of a reference ecosystem. So again, that's why it seems most important that we identify a reference relationship to place, because in times of climate change, the actual species composition is a moving target. We need to help our plant and animal relatives move, and to know that this is a work in progress. So it is thriving relationships that will keep the system resilient, rather than a static configuration.
Paulette, you're muted.
Thank you. How do we begin to ask? We are going to the moon and Mars to stay. What is our responsibility to the moon, and what rights does the moon have? From a Native perspective, nature has rights. Would you or others consider helping the Artemis program understand our relationship to our sister moon? It's a deep question.
It absolutely is. I mean, I think one of my first responses to this is, I need to learn more. I don't know about this program. And my first reaction, I guess, when I often see the curiosity that drives us to think about visits to this premise here, we are going to the moon and Mars to stay, is that our first responsibility is to our earthly home. And if we are to move more broadly, let's not repeat the same extractive, colonizing perspective that we enacted on our own planet.
I have to agree with you. I think that there's so many problems on the earth still that we're trying to figure out, that I'm not prepared to start trying to answer questions about space, because I clearly am not in that realm outside of my discipline. So the next question is, non-Indigenous researchers and PI seem to claim traditional knowledges of Indigenous people. I understand it is the way of the Western paradigm. How can we ensure that the non-Native researchers understand they do not own or cannot claim or take credit for Indigenous knowledges other than with IRB?
This is part of the work of our community, isn't it? Educating our collaborators. And I know that these questions are going to be addressed later in this whole gathering, and I'm so glad that they are. One of the approaches that I try to take with my own colleagues in educating them about this is to kind of meet them where they are within their own paradigm of citation, right? When we're writing within the strictly Western paradigm, we all know the rules for citation. Well, let's take that same kind of rigor and apply it to acknowledging the sources of Indigenous knowledge and both the immediate knowledge holders and the collective knowledge holders. That's a place to start.
Excellent, thank you. And the next question. How do you recommend that scientists work on their internal journey towards decolonization, transformative justice, while keeping up with their SEK work, since so often academic institutions or professional organizations do not prioritize this growth?
Absolutely true. It is swimming upstream, isn't it? I think that putting our science into the context of justice and well-being becomes a lever for resisting exactly the kind of pressures the questioner speaks of. To say that if incorporation of multiple knowledges is seen as something on the side that you do, it's harder to justify it to our colleagues who don't think it's important. But if we reframe knowledge as coupled to responsibility for knowledge, Western science uncoupled those things. It's a knowledge for knowledge's sake, and all the publications that come from it are what are important. But what if we remind ourselves that coupling knowledge and responsibility is a central paradigm, then the work of engaging in multiple ways of knowing, engaging justice, becomes central to our work, not peripheral, and is therefore, I think, can become transformative, not only in our own careers, but in those of the folks we work with.
Yeah, and then to tag on to that, can we continue to have the institutions that have the funding continue to fund these kinds of work? Absolutely.
Good point, Paulette. Yeah, absolutely. It's way beyond our own departments and institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the next question. Many Indigenous professors who really use Indigenous worldview and knowledge in their classes do not get very real pushback in the form of denied tenures, or they do get very real pushback in the form of denied tenures and their contracts not being renewed. How can we exist in academia? I've had this happen to me. What are your thoughts on surviving academia and the gatekeepers?
Yeah. This is worthy, of course, of much deeper discussion than we can engage in right here. I think we should have a whole separate forum on exactly this. But the guidance that I would offer is very much an echo of what I just said about making visible the notion that we're going to do science differently, and to claim that, not to necessarily assimilate into the expectations and the currency of your institution. To say, you're expecting excellence in scholarship and research here. The way I define excellence is research that looks like this. And to claim that from the outset so that you're setting your own goals and expectations. Will you get pushback? Mm-hmm. Yes, you will. And then you push back to say, this is how I do science. You hired me to come here, not to replicate what you do, but to celebrate what I do.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I have time for one more quick question. And that would be, how do we acknowledge learning is emotional and includes grief? This is also rooted in healing and reconnecting to the land.
Yeah. in doing this work within our Indigenous communities, within our Indigenous homelands, we are inevitably sharing the weight of our histories and our relatives and our fears for the future on our shoulders in a way that is different from our non-Native colleagues because of the emotional resonance of all of the work that we do. We are still living our ancestors' stories. We're living our descendants' stories. It is right to feel grief. It is right to feel apprehension and the determination that comes from it. I would say we don't shy away from it. We remember that grief is the mirror of our love, and it's our love that will propel us forward.
That was perfectly stated, Robin. Thank you so very much. And I apologize to all those that had more questions. We can save those questions and pass them along to Robin. Let's give a quick thank you, a round of applause to Robin. I am so grateful for your work, and your work grounded my own understanding of how we are mentored by place. And so some of the work I have going forward is talking about that mentoring from place. And thank you so much for your work, because I am so inspired as a geographer and as a Native woman to be grounded and being intentional and unapologetic for myself and my work. And with that, thank you, Robin. And I will announce that we have a 15-minute break until 1:30. So please feel free to get up, walk around, do what you need to do. And then we will have a panel with Dr. Deb McGregor, Dr. Margaret Redsteer, and Jackie Catalina Schaefer. And these three women are amazing scholars, Indigenous, and have a lot of amazing stuff to say. So I look forward to this panel. Robin, please feel free to stay with us if you'd like to.
I sure will.
And I look forward to these incredible conversations. So with that, Nyahweh, Nyahweh, thank you so much. And I look forward to the next time we get to visit.